It's great to be here, at least virtually, even if we can't be together. I really wish we were, but that's kind of how life is right now. What I wanted to do today is to kind of provide you an update with where we are with MSIX. We're about 2 years from Microsoft's original announcement. It's been out there for a year and a half, at least in theory. Microsoft, of course, has been releasing MSIX in phases, so it's still a work in progress. But I wanted to give you an update on where we are today. One of the things that I've been doing is I have a website called MSIXconf.com, so sort of like MSIX, but MSIX. And that is a site that we've been using to provide community information about MSIX. And one of the big features of that is a project that I do every year called the MSIX Report Card. So I released this year's report card in January of this year. And what I want to do as part of this session is sort of provide a little bit of review of what's in there, but also an update as to where we are right now, because things continue to move along as we go on. So what the kind of things that we include in this report is I tried to provide an overall survey for the different audiences for MSIX. We talk a bit about the support for MSIX that's built into the operating system itself, some of the tooling that's available for developers, and then the packaging tools that are available either from Microsoft or from the third-party partners that are out there. Some of the tooling for deployment we cover as well. And we try to talk a little bit about what's actually out there released by software vendors in MSIX format. So this is the second year that I've done this report, and we'll continue that again next year as well. One of the new features we did this year, though, is I added a survey that we ran last fall. So, watching Ruben and Christian and Mark earlier, I was thinking maybe I should have called this MSIX like an amateur. I thought that would be a good name for it, but no, we didn't. But we ran two surveys, one for software development companies and one for IT pros. And I'll share some of those results with you here today as well. But before I do that, let me just quickly review a little bit about MSIX and where we are today. So in terms of the benefits for MSIX, the number one thing that Microsoft likes to talk about today is that this is a user installation technology. So this is a replacement for the MSI, but it's really geared towards users being able to install and uninstall applications on their own. And a very key part of that is that this whole process needs to protect the operating system. Microsoft loves to use the term never regret. You'll never regret installing one of these applications because you can always uninstall it and it's a completely clean uninstall. So those are very, very key features to what Microsoft wants to accomplish with this. And the fourth benefit here was really number one on Microsoft's list as they came out with the technology, was that you would be able to distribute these applications via the Microsoft Store. And that was very important to them at the time that they started this process, and it's really kind of lowered down on the list of priorities over time. Now, part of that is due to the fact that Microsoft has recognized that people don't really want to go to the Microsoft Store all that much to go get their software. And certainly in terms of enterprise software, there's not as much software up in the store. Software vendors would prefer to continue to sell software directly to enterprises and not use Microsoft as a broker to do that. So we're going to see MSIX apps show up in the store for folks that do want to purchase through that method, but we're really going to see the software vendors continue to use the same types of techniques that they've used in the past to be able to sell and distribute the software to you. Of course, one of the other new things that's coming out this year that's really important in this area is MSIX App Attached. And there's certainly been a lot of energy around that, which is based on some of the work done by the folks from the Flexera group that got absorbed into Microsoft. And the idea with MSIX App Attached is that you'd be able to have this standard image, and then over some type of network, you would be able to have these packages come in and get applied to the system in a very rapid fashion. This is actually kind of harping back to the original days of SoftGrid and the way that it worked. The concept that I can have the standard image, I can have a user show up, and after they log in, immediately all of their apps show up. Now, the way App Attached does it is a little bit different than the way AppB did it. We get an extremely fast logon time with App Attached because for the most part, what they're doing is they're putting in place the shortcuts, but not really installing the application until the user requests that application. So from a performance perspective, we'll be able to have multi-user operating systems with lots of users that get really fast logins. But the first person on that system to launch that app is going to see a bit of a delay as it actually gets fully instantiated on the system during that launch time. But once it's there, then everyone else is going to get the benefit of that. So I think we're very excited about the technology, but it's still very early days with it. So there isn't anyone that has significant production experience with this today, and I'm sure there's going to be some glitches and some things that have to get fixed over time, but it does look very promising at this point. So if we take a look at the applications that are out there, which is the real target here for MSIX. We want to replace the MSI. We want to provide a way for enterprises to be able to prepare applications and rapidly get them deployed as well. And Microsoft has given different numbers in different times I've seen. This is just one that I pulled out, that there are over 35 million apps out in the world. I've also heard the number 60 million. And as you can see, there's a lot of different versions of that. And so we have these applications over time. They kind of come into different categories. We have the really old things that I will refer to as WinForms. And WinForms are those old apps that you're used to where there's a little dialog box. You'll get some text boxes on it and some buttons to do some things. And those programs are typically written in C or C++, what we call unmanaged code. So it's a lot of work for the developer to write that type of program, but it's surprising how popular it still is. There are lots and lots of developers out there who really did not want to move into the more modern way of building applications because they find this easier. The next thing that came out, and this actually started at this point 19 years ago, WPF and .NET was first announced in 2001. I remember being on the Microsoft campus for what was called the Hailstorm announcement, which was .NET. And it's built on some different technologies. So the dialogues, instead of this proprietary binary thing that they had, we now have XAML, which is sort of like a special brand of HTML in terms of its format. And it's easier to build dialogues that do things like scale automatically or handle high DPI situations. And then the programming model underneath it was called the .NET framework, which was different. And programmers had to learn how to write their programs differently to work in the .NET framework. And it didn't necessarily have all of the functionality they wanted. But Microsoft has always been very good about being able to have backwards compatibility. So they provided a nice interface that your .NET code could call any of the old unmanaged code that you had in the past. This is referred to as primary interop or PIO some cases. But it made all of the old code, and particularly things that were written in COM, available to programs written in this more modern form. And so we have bevies of developers who have been going down this road with the more modern WPF style applications for quite some time. And then Microsoft did something a little bit different. They wanted to be able to address a market that they thought that they were losing. And so if you go back a number of years, we've got what we now call the Windows API, but they came out with this other thing that they called the UWP API. So this is a new programming model. It used a slightly different version of the XAML than what was used in WPF. And it also had a totally new version of the .NET framework that they called .NET Core. And the whole purpose of this was to be something that was very, very portable. They wanted to be able to win back a lot of the gaming developers they'd lost who were building applications for iOS first, and then they'd port it to Android, and then they'd port it maybe to Microsoft. And of course, in the time frame this started, Microsoft Phone was still a thing, and that was very important to Microsoft. So they wanted to get developers and give them an opportunity to build their app once and not have to go through that porting experience so that Microsoft could have these game apps much faster. Well, to get all of that to work and to make it portable, they really kind of had to start from scratch and take pieces of what they had before and rewrite them in portable ways. And so that's what the .NET Core is all about. It's about this portable version of the .NET framework, which can work on all of these different operating systems without the developer having to deal with any of the operating system specific things. The only thing the developer really needed to worry about were differences in the form factor. You know, what type of display do I have? Do I have a large 11-inch display, or am I looking at something that's more phone size? Because you're going to build your user interface a little bit different with that. But they did a pretty good job of that in terms of the portability, but unfortunately, these Windows Universal apps run inside a container. And inside the container, there were a lot of restrictions, and there was nowhere near the flexibility that developers were used to having in this Windows API, which had been around for almost 30 years, the Windows API. And the UWP API was very, very small. There was very little they can do. And as a result, what we saw out of this were the apps that were up in the Windows Store were primarily entertainment style applications, or applications that were really a little small GUI front end, and all of the real programming was done on a cloud service somewhere. But enterprise scale applications that we're used to seeing really didn't show up in the universal apps because the developers really couldn't do the things that they needed to do with it. It was just too much isolation in there. So Microsoft decided to do a little something about that, and they created initially what was called Centennial, which was an attempt at getting developers to take their code and get it to run inside a container and start migrating their code over to the Windows Universal apps. And the big carrot that they tried to wave in front of everybody was, if you do this, you can get in the Microsoft Store. Microsoft's criteria for things that can go in the Microsoft Store are things that really meet what I talked about, the benefits of MSIX early on. Clean install, clean uninstall, can't affect the operating system or other applications on the operating system. But Centennial running inside the container was also a little too constraining. So they went back to the drawing board and came up with MSIX. And with MSIX, the concept was we could take any of the existing software, and with some changes in the way the container works, we'd be able to run these things and be able to get the kind of rich experiences that enterprise apps have, but be able to do it in a safe way and be able to distribute these things via the store. Microsoft found a lot of interest from the IT pros along this with this, but not necessarily as much from the developers. So they've continued to work this and to provide better carrots for the developers. And some of the changes that they've made in the last year, particularly we had the Build conference last month, which is their annual developers conference. And Microsoft had been hinting at some things at developers privately until then, but now they finally publicly acknowledged this concept of WinUI 3 as the new kind of version of doing the user interface pieces. And that's really where Microsoft is putting all of their efforts today, are in the WinUI 3 and .NET Core area. But they're also expanding what MSIX is and encouraging the developers so that they can kind of mix and match the various components that you see here. So they can take their existing application that's totally written in WPF and start consuming some of the things off on the far right-hand side, or the other way around. They could start their app in WinUI 3 and consume some of the stuff from XAML through XAML Islands, or even some of the old WinForm dialogues, as well as some of the underlying code that is calling the old Windows APIs, and mix and match these things. And this really looks like it's going to be the carrot to really get the developers on board with MSIX in the future, because now they'll be able to have the full capabilities that they need. Not that there aren't still issues with getting there, but there is that carrot that will really help them want to move along this way. So what about the existing applications? We have all of these things, and the IT pro community has been really interested in MSIX going forward. So, Microsoft has their own packaging tool called the Microsoft MSIX Packaging Tool. It's a free tool up in the Microsoft Store, but the third-party vendors have also stepped in, and enhance their programs. So Advanced Installer, Admin Studio, some of the other folks all have the ability to do repackaging into MSIX, into AppV, and now into MSIX format as well. So we're getting some good capabilities that are out there. But when we take a look at the way things work with MSIX, it is running inside this container, which is an isolation environment. And that interferes with some of the way that these traditional applications expected to run. But inside the operating system, in all versions of the OS, we have this thing that I'll refer to as the MSIX runtime. It isn't anything you can really see. It's really just embedded into the OS itself. But it's there. But this existing code would call the standard Windows APIs that they're used to calling. And then the MSIX runtime will make some modifications. So if you think about app virtualization and doing file redirection and registry redirection, those are things that the MSIX runtime is involved with to make that work. But Microsoft actually built this with a two-fork strategy. So the MSIX runtime does part of what you need to get standard applications to work, but they also created something called the package support framework, which kind of slides into the middle there between the application and the Windows API itself. So this is Detours based, which is a Microsoft technology that was used to build AppV as well as Microsoft UEV, and they also sold it to a number of vendors. I wouldn't be too surprised that some of the UEM products that we see out there is using Detours as well. But it allows a developer to be able to target any Windows API call and then modify what that call does. So we do this transformation right at that level. And when we combine that with the MSIX runtime, we have a lot more flexibility in being able to remediate old application code to work inside this new containerized environment. So I did run this survey, or these two surveys last year. So these were done in the fall, and I want to share some of the results with you. So again, we had two different surveys, one for developers and one for IT pros. And unlike the survey we saw this morning, most of the respondents I got on this were from Europe, which is really kind of strange when you think about it. But there seems to be much more interest in MSIX in Europe than there is here in North America. We asked the folks of the different groups, why they were interested in MSIX, and we heard them respond back with some of the things that Microsoft has told them MSIX is all about. From the developer standpoint, though, they very clearly heard the message that this is a replacement for the MSI going forward, that this is something that they're going to need to do to be able to distribute their software in the future. So they're very interested in it because of that. Whereas with the IT pros, it's a mix of that, right? It's both having the MSI going away, but they also look at it as a replacement for AppV. Now, is it a replacement for AppV? Well, we're going to have to wait and see. AppV is still there. It's not being enhanced. And if MSIX turns out to have the capability of handling all of the enterprise apps to be able to do that dynamic delivery, then yeah, AppV will go away. Quite frankly, I think it'll be a long time before that happens, and I'm not sure MSIX will ever get to the level of compatibility that Microsoft can really replace AppV with it, but we'll have to wait and see how that goes. So from the developers, we did ask them, have you released applications? Because it's very hard for us to tell whether or not there are apps out in the world that are using MSIX. Even if you go to the Microsoft Store, you can't go figure it out unless you were to download every single app in the store and break it open to look to see whether or not it's MSIX based. So we asked the question, and the results we got back were about what we expected, which is there really isn't much anything out there. The person at the end there that answered they'd released 10 or more applications in MSIX, I actually don't even believe that person because I don't see any evidence of any company that's done that out there. It's possible that there's someone that has some in-house applications, so they released it within their own company, but certainly in terms of commercially available software, we just don't see very much out there at all. We also asked them what they expect to do in the next year, and we see that there is a mild level of interest that's there. Again, this survey was done last fall, so this is before the newer announcements with the carrots. I think we would see much more interest from the developers if we ran that survey again today. And we'll probably run one again next fall, and we'll find out if that's the case. I did ask the developers that question again in a later part in a different form. And in that case, we saw considerably more interest in getting something going this year with MSIX from them. We also asked IT pros, how many Windows applications do your company deploy? We want to understand the audience here. And for the large part, the responses we got back were from the larger enterprises. And these, quite frankly, there's a lot of people here who are probably my customers that participated in here. I'm not a huge industry organization like VDI, like a pro, so I don't get the same number of responses. And I'm going to be hearing from the kind of folks who probably are here at EDVC as well. But these were larger enterprises in general. We also I wanted to ask them about what OSs they were on, because that turns out to be very important with MSIX. That MSIX runtime changes on each new version of the operating system, and the capabilities change with that. So we really kind of have to pay attention to that. And what I was seeing out of this is that most of these companies are on 1 to 2 year refresh cycles with the operating system, which is kind of what my experience had been with the customers that I deal with. Certainly not the 6-month schedule that Microsoft would love everyone to start using. Okay, sorry, I skipped over that. So we also asked about the churn rate of their applications. So how often are you really updating these applications? And from this, we could see about 30% of the apps aren't updated yearly. My personal experience with these large customers that I work with is about 10% of their apps are 10 or more years old. So companies like to get something working, and they like to just keep it and use it for as long as they can possibly use it. This is particularly true for apps that these companies have created in-house. Usually they create the in-house application, and after a couple of years, there's no possibility of that app ever getting updated again. So if it needed to be changed, it's going to have to be totally replaced, and someone was going to have to write a replacement to be able to do that. So they hang on to these apps for as long as they can. We did ask them how many apps they've gotten from vendors in the MSIX format, and as you can see, almost nothing from anybody. I'm guessing the 1 and 2 people that are there, one of those apps would have been mine, but not much out there yet that people have seen. We also asked them about their plans to repackage, and we saw a significant number of them saying, yeah, I want to be doing some repackaging here, if not now, within the next year. But still, almost 30% saying, no, I really don't want to be doing any repackaging, and I want to wait for the vendors to release in this format instead. We asked them how many apps they have deployed. So did they repackage and deploy, right? They haven't received much. And again, we saw very little deployment that's out there yet. People are still kind of touching it and playing with it and trying to understand what they can and can't do with the technology at this point. And we also asked about their plans. And yes, they are planning to do more this year. And it'll be interesting to see how much they actually accomplished during this year when we run the survey again next year. Also asked them when they thought MSIX will be ready. We didn't try to define what that meant. But when's it going to be ready for production use in your environment? And the vast majority were looking at 2021 as kind of their target, where they wanted to be able to deploy significant MSIX applications out in production. And I would say that that might be a little bit aggressive, but it's probably realistic. As long as you're not thinking about, I'm going to have my entire portfolio moved over to MSIX and in production in 2021, I think you're still going to be dealing with a lot of MSIs during that period. But in terms of being able to have a significant portion of your applications, yeah, I think we can get there by then. So for the report card, one of the other key features of it is I go through a full testing process with a set of applications. So in the first year of the report card, I did 40 apps. In the January edition for this year, I did 60 apps. I now have got about 65 in my list of things that I'm regularly testing. And wanted to look at the application compatibility with these. And when I do application compatibility here, I'm usually using a pretty tight criteria with that. So in terms of what we found with this in terms of just taking an application, packaging it up, and trying to run it, not using the PSF because that's a complication that makes it a little more difficult. I found about 20% of these enterprise applications worked fine without needing the PSF at all. And then when we bring in the package support framework, about half of the remaining applications, there were things built into the PSF that would address the problems that we saw. Didn't necessarily mean that the PSF would make the application work, but for the initial issues that we saw, there were things in the PSF that could directly address those pieces. But there was still another half of those that we really had nothing in the PSF that would help that at all. So we've been working and progressing on that a little bit, and as you'll see later on here, then the numbers are going to look a little better as we start moving forward. So the kinds of problems that we see with these MSIX applications, things around the shortcuts are the biggest, and they're very easy to take care of as well. But it would be there's a change in the way the working directory works, so applications don't find their resources if they were depending upon that properly. We don't have command line arguments and shortcuts in these modern applications, and so we had to use the PSF as a way to bring those types of things back in. We also couldn't have shortcuts pointing to things that weren't executables. But apps would have problems finding their DLLs. They'd have difficulties finding their files or writing to the files, as well as writing to the registry. And then there were a slew of other issues that come up. I listed here shell APIs and fonts as a couple of biggies. The shell APIs are coming along. We now get some of the more common shell extensions like context menus, but we're still missing a bunch of others. Services used to be on that list, but we now have services as of this spring. So that one had to fall off of the list. But these are the most common issues that we see when bringing these applications over. This is the criteria that I use on the testing. So, at the bottom, we've got the success. And then from the red and above, we have things that are just basically different forms of total failures. There's no functionality for this application that's usable when you put it in MSIX today. And in between, there's a couple of a little more subjective criteria there. So my criteria for success is based on the concept that you already have this application deployed using an MSI today, and would you be willing to have this app packaged up in MSIX and replace the MSI version today with it? And success means that everything works the same. There will be no end user complaints. That blue category of partial features really means that there are some really minor little things that are annoyances. Some companies will take a look at that and say, well, no, I'm not going to change out an existing MSI for that because I'm going to get complaints from end users. And some organizations would say, no, I'm fine, and I would go with that. So that's a little more subjective. And in the yellow category, we have some features that don't work. The main functionality of the product seems to work just fine, but there are some important features that could be an issue. Okay, I see a question here. Can one identify MSIX usage by process name? Is there a Windows process name which, if running, indicates MSIX is being used? The answer to the question you asked is no, you can't do it by process name. The process name will look the same. However, there is a trick that you can do. It doesn't necessarily identify only MSIX, but any application that is running under the MSIX container or the UWP container or Microsoft App V will have a job ID. So if you go into the task manager and add the column to look at job IDs, or if you use Process Explorer to look at it, you'll see that there's a job ID there. And that's an indication to you that it's running in some type of container. So that's the trick that I use today. Okay, so the latest results. So this is testing beyond the January. So I run the tests, and I use App V as sort of my benchmark technology. So the list of apps that I have are apps that largely come from enterprises I've worked with. There's a few special purpose apps that I added in that hit particular portions of the Windows API that I know are very important. I want to isolate those out. But it does reject, that list rejects a whole bunch of things that we know do not work in MSIX and probably never will. As it turns out, those are the same things that are also problematic in App V. So most customers wouldn't say I can do 93% of my apps in App V. They would have a lower number, maybe 80%, because things that have like device drivers and things like that, you just wouldn't even think about doing with these technologies. So that's the kind of list that we have here. But I run all of these apps through with AppV, and I get a pretty good completion rate with those because AppV's been around a long time. We've learned how to deal with it. Looking at the Microsoft packaging tool, but not using the PSF, because Microsoft has added some things to that MSIX runtime, as long as you're running on the latest version of the OS, which at this point would mean the 20H1 release, the 2004 release, we've gone from about 20% to 29% just without the PSF itself. So they've made some significant improvements there in the runtime, but those aren't available to you until you get to that version of the OS. When we bring in the PSF, now this is using the PSF that I used during the January paper. So this is using a tool of mine called PSF Tooling 3.2. And that had a version of the PSF, which was basically from December of last year when I created that version. And bringing in the PSF got us about a 10% increase. I was actually very disappointed with that. I spend a lot of time writing code for the PSF myself. So it's an open source repository up on GitHub, and I'm one of the major contributors up there to fix additional problems that PSF wasn't doing. And I spent a lot of time last year creating additional fixes and improving some of the fixes that were up there. And when I got around to doing the testing, I run a preliminary round of testing in the October timeframe, and I share those results with the different vendors. And I was very disappointed that I was only seeing about a 5% increase at that point. So I've actually changed some of my strategy on how I try to improve the PSF. As you'll see later on, we're starting to see a little better results in my latest set here. But we were up to nearly 40% success rate when we bring in the PSF with that version of the PSF from December. The latest results, though, we're now over that 50% mark. So this is using PSF Tooling 3.6, which is currently up in the Microsoft store. So that's a free app that you'd use in conjunction with the Microsoft packaging tool. So we finally gotten just over that 50% mark. And in fact, with some of the changes that I just submitted into a pull request yesterday, we're now up to about 53% with those latest changes. I've added a new fix type for that. So what's next year going to look like? I mean, that's a real question here, right? Where are we going to be in terms of this compatibility? You know, we went from about 20% the first year because the PSF really wasn't even viable when I did the first year's testing to about 40%. We're seeing a little over 50. Before the pandemic, you know, I would have thought that we were going to end this next year at somewhere between 60 to 70, but pretty close to the 70% rate. I had a lot of things that I wanted to do to the PSF during this year and was planning to spend a significant amount of time doing that. But, you know, then the pandemic happened, and that number is definitely changing. My business has completely changed. Normally, I would have expected to have spent about 2/3 to 3/4 of my time working on MSIX and the PSF, you know, trying to improve that as part of my community involvement. But quite frankly, I had to rebuild my business. You know, I had to go from a business which was a completely in-person type event-driven business to turning it into a remote business, and that's requiring a lot of my time. So I'm not going to spend as much. So we're going to end up somewhere. I mean, we're at 53%. We'll probably get a little beyond that, so maybe 55. But I'd be very surprised that we hit 60 unless Microsoft steps up and starts doing some more of the work themselves. And right now, they're really not doing that work on the PSF. So I'm trying to encourage them to do that. Okay, so that's kind of, wow, it's faster than I thought. That's kind of my quick review of where we are with MSIX. I do want to mention that we do have the workshop tomorrow. So this is an add-on thing, but it's not too late to register. You can just email Mary Jane at murjur@tmerchant.com, and she'll send you a PayPal invoice, and you can sign up for that. So this will be a little bit of a hands-on workshop. Oh, in fact, here's Mary Jane now. This will be a little bit of a hands-on workshop. We'll play around with doing some packaging and try to have a better environment where we can really all be live and have our audio on and cameras on and really talk to each other. So I look forward to seeing some of you there tomorrow. And other than that,
10 minutes.
thank you. I know, I finished early. Let's take a look if there are more questions in here. Alex maybe can remind people to send some questions up. If not, I'll, let's see. I can talk a little bit about the PSF itself while I wait for some questions. So the packet support framework, we have these different types of fixes. So you have a launcher involved in the process, and that solves a lot of the things I had mentioned there about the shortcut issues. So that's kind of the first piece that we bring into play. But after that, we've got several different fix-ups that you would add in as intercepts in there. The very first one we use is called the trace fix-up. And I built a tool called PSF Monitor that's part of the PSF, which is sort of like a Procmon-like user interface for displaying that trace information. So with that, we can see exactly what API the application is calling and which ones are failing, and that helps us target which of the solutions that we want to use and bring into play. The big solution we bring in most of the time is the file redirection fix-up. So these applications have issues. If the application puts any data into app data local or app data roaming as part of its installation, without the PSF, the application doesn't see it. So the file redirection fixes that. It also allows the application to then be able to write to any of those files. Without the packet support framework, it can't do that. The application files are read-only and protected in that fashion. So to get that kind of copy on write technology that we're used to having in AppV, we bring in the file redirection fix-up to take care of those types of problems. The second type of fix-up that we have is one that I wrote called the dynamic library fix-up. So that's to help the application find the DLLs that are inside the package. There are a number of reasons that an application wouldn't find it within MSIX. I mentioned the current working directory, but we don't have support for things like changes to path variables or app path registrations. So this is a fix-up. You just stick it in there. It says, hey, if the DLL is in the package, I'm going to find it for you. You don't have to worry about it. So it's a very simple fix-up for those types of problems. And the last one, which is what I just wrote and submitted yesterday, is called a registry called Reg Legacy fix-ups. This is the first of a series of fix-ups that'll be inside there, but it allows us to be able to intercept registry key calls where an application might be opening a key and requesting permissions it really didn't need. So if it opened up a key, it really would only, I was trying to like read some things under it, but a lot of times the app developer was lazy and just say, yeah, give me full access to the key. And if you're an app developer, you know, you've always had full access to the H key current user keys that are part of your package. And so they would have their code just say, yeah, I want full permissions. And that includes things like I can delete the key. And MSIX refuses to give that type of response back. So we now have a fix-up that'll and say, okay, you know, when they call for this thing, if they ask for the full access, let's just give them the access that they need, and hopefully that will solve the problem for the application.